Hi everyone, thank you for joining me in relation to part 2 of our pre-scene video series at Astranti. Thanks for coming back. I hope that you found part 1 helpful and that you've made some notes and you're just getting a little bit more familiar with NCTech and indeed the industry in which it operates. Just a quick reminder of the key from pre-scene video part 1 in terms of how we're going to flow through the next couple of pages 6 to 8. Green areas certainly core for us. Let's get them memorized, rote learned as quickly as possible. Yellow add-on as we walk through the video itself, and indeed some flags, some red flags. We are going to go to the syllabus, revise the content. Now, 1 or 2 of the red flags within this particular part 2 sort of direct you outside the syllabus. Don't worry about that. I'm just trying to think of angles with this examiner and topic areas that he may go to. Okay, I may get it right, I may get it wrong, but no harm in trying. Okay, so in this first area of part 3, the background information. Now, from video series part 1 on the pre-scene, we have a reasonable feel for what's going on with this particular company, and indeed certainly more of a feel for the industry. Now, clearly they are well established and indeed well known. We know that the 3 founders set up this particular business 10 years ago, and broadly speaking there has been success, but they do operate in a very, very competitive environment. I would suggest going back 10 years that these 3 guys are pretty savvy, and certainly you might suggest that perhaps along with 1 or 2 others they took the opportunity on first mover advantage to see that this was the way to go going forward. Okay, we see from the second paragraph, and again we mentioned this in the early part we were looking at the industry, just about any individual and certainly most businesses would have a need for the type of services, whether or not it's simply IAS or indeed any of the other 2 options, in one way, shape or form. And certainly the key thing for businesses outside of scalability is that costs will have dropped and will continue to drop over time. One of the things that we're going to do in this video is flag future opportunities for NCTech and the board. Okay, note just the bottom of the paragraph here, and I will show annotations in a moment. I do have this particular PDF, as you'd expect, pretty well annotated over and above what you see in green. Little reference there, NCTech never offered PAS or SAS. Now, one of the things from the early part of pre-scene video 1 that you recall that I said is that in terms of the SEMA guidance, they say no signals. Okay, well, fair enough. But, for me, given my experience of dealing with case study exam, if that's not a signal, I don't know what it is. Now, this has been mentioned several times in this pre-scene. Now, again, anyone who says that they know that what's coming up in December 23 in terms of questions is a crazy person, me included. But we've got to cover our bases. So again, as mentioned, and I know I'm repeating myself, when we think about moving from the current business model towards one of the other 2, either PAS or SAS, then we've got to think of what's involved in doing that. Is it suitable? Is it acceptable? Is it feasible? How does it tie in with the mission and vision? Well, of course it does. This business is a profit-making business. It's there to expand, to make money. It's listed. Of course it does. But let's also consider that within the unseen, in other words, the material that you're provided with on the day, is highly likely or highly unlikely that the examiner will just hand things to you on a plate. So what I mean by that is if there are opportunities for expansion, new products, either in these 2 areas, then let's also look for potential downsides and risks. In other words, typical question, again as mentioned in pre-scene video 1, is perhaps strategic benefits and risks of doing this, of acquiring this company, of going in this direction. So let's think like an employee or a consultant or an advisor, and let's think of upsides and downsides. We know how important risk is in this syllabus, and we've got to be familiar with that. More of that later. So what I'll do now is let me just turn on the annotations. And as you see, there's quite a lot in here. First thing I want to remind you about is something that I've just mentioned. Great, this company is well known. Any well-known company has a reputation. And we know from the SBL exam in the past that this whole area of types of risk that are in play is a question that he likes to ask. Now, if we think about risk within the SBL syllabus, if you were to list down the different types of risk that a business like NCTech is faced with, God, there must be 12, 15. I'm talking about everything from strategic risk, product risk, health and safety, key succession, etc., etc., etc. So here, let's make sure that we can spot within the unseen different types of risk, okay? And even if we're not good at that, let's make sure that if we get a question on, something along the lines of, oh, well, given this unseen scenario, what type of risks are the board NCTech subject to? Well, I'm wheeling out the big ones. Yeah, it's not that difficult to understand what product risk is, what international risk is, what political risk is, etc., etc. Not that difficult. So let's not arrive on exam day not knowing every single type of risk that this business could be faced with either now or if it changes things in the future. Okay, so we know that, as I say, around for 10 years, this is a rapidly growing industry. These guys are hot, they're on their game, they're building for the future. In terms of this reference down here, now, something that I picked up from my own research is this here. I always like to look at sort of all angles. Now, in essence, what we know about NCTech is this is a business model, even at the IAS level, that a number of businesses, individuals are interested in. Great, okay, so they're very, very popular. People are buying what they're selling. But, one of the things from a client or a customer perspective that you've got to be aware of, and you can Google this and find out for yourself, don't believe me, is that if you're a client of one of these CSPs, a big thing online in terms of issues is getting locked in. In other words, getting locked in to NCTech. What do I mean by that? Well, if I'm a client, if I come along to NCTech, obviously there's going to be some sort of negotiation and there's going to be contractual arrangements. And the problem for me, it's a sort of eggs and baskets really here, is the idea that, if I lock into a company, then I'm sort of stuck with them for several reasons. Data transfer costs. And there's the idea that if I'm using their facilities or others, the cost of transferring to another supplier, another provider, it manifold, okay? The other issue is most companies, and I'm talking real life here, and you'll see this referenced within the industry analysis, most companies use their own software, okay? So for the client, forget NCTech for the moment, for the client, there's problems. So what's the advice online in relation to clients? And it's always interesting to look at this from the perspective of the user or the client or the customer. What the big word on the street is SLAs, is that customers of NCTech need to be careful. They need to be careful that their SLAs is bulletproof. I mean, that's just solid business advice. And if you're going to engage in any way, shape or form, make sure your contractual terms are clear, in writing, bulletproof, and indeed that you take legal advice. Okay? So, outside of that, and indeed notwithstanding that problem, certainly it would appear that clients of NCTech must be cost conscious. Why? Because basically they're using their own expertise in-house, and they're using what we've described in pre-scene video 1 as the basic service. They could move up to another provider and use PAS. They're not doing that. So it seems to me that this wide client base that they're currently dealing with are very interested in cost. Now, notwithstanding that, we know, as I've said several times, both in this video and indeed a couple of times in pre-scene video 1, costs are going to come down. And indeed, it's highly likely that NCTech are going to move in a different direction. Okay? So there's our sort of first, not so much slide, but our first area. Forget the ownership for a moment because I'm going to turn annotations off and then take you through that area. So I hope that that made sense. Watch out for the flags as we see them. Okay, so we're going to sort of move into the ownership area. Now, again, some of this has been referenced already, but I may be, repeating myself. I don't mind as long as it goes in and we get savvy as quickly as possible with this pre-scene. So what do we see in terms of ownership? Well, we see that from the off, I'm guessing ballpark 10 years ago or so, it was VC backed. Okay, but that has now been repaid, and indeed we'll see for the last 5 years listed on the Farland Stock Exchange. Now we know from our opening video that this is a developed country. We talked about Porter's Diamond, etc. We talked about regulation. So here, obviously, and indeed as mentioned previously, the whole area of corporate governance is in play. More of that in a moment. But certainly, the board of NCTech and indeed the players involved at a high level have to be aware of the implications of being listed, not just from the whole area of CG, but also, things like the agency, the agency principle, the stewardship role, and, a common sort of phrase within SBL exams is the examiner will mention the whole area of shareholder wealth maximization, and indeed everyone working towards that goal. And it could be that he targets that particular area. Now, in terms of the share structure now, or indeed the ownership structure, we see that nobody has more than 10%, and each of the founders have 10% each. Okay. Now, it says down the page that there appears to be, in terms of the management of the business, a fair degree of latitude. In other words, latitude on the part of institutional investors, such as the pension funds and unit trusts, and indeed perhaps other single shareholders who aren't involved in the management of the company. There's some latitude, so some freedom, some autonomy. That doesn't mean that we couldn't get something on the day in this area where someone gets the hump, someone gets annoyed about something, and we're required to take action and or to advise the board. What would we do in that sort of scenario? What would we do if things weren't as rosy as what they appear on this screen? Well, I think we'd have to be mentioning really from the ground up the areas that I've just touched on: shareholder wealth maximization, certainly the agency principle, stewardship, ethics, corporate governance, and what corporate governance means, what good corporate governance means. Okay. Moving down, we see that they're fully committed. Our three founders are fully committed. Now, he's mentioned that several times. Great, sounds okay. Why he keeps mentioning that, I'm not so sure. One issue here outside of the three main people is the fact that board membership has not changed in the last 5 years. Now, a question for you. Is that a good idea? Is that 100% in line with broad corporate governance good practice? I'll leave that for you to decide. What I would say is that there's reference within the pre-scene, as you've probably seen, to the fact that currently NCTech complies across the board with corporate governance good practice in Farland. So that's a question, isn't it? I'm just wondering, what do we mean, or what do I mean by that? I wonder if you can figure that out. Okay, so we move into the third paragraph. It's talking about the shares and indeed performance, this whole area of sort of beta, I guess. So it looks as if, in terms of performance, everything's been good and cushy over the last 5 years. But certainly, and here you see I've mentioned a red flag left-hand side, a fall in gross profit. It's affected the share price and unsettled some shareholders. Now, for me, again, there's no signals according to the ACCA, fair enough, okay? But this is an issue. If you were part of the board, if you were one of the founders, and we'll see from the financial extracts within pre-scene video part 3, that there's a fairly significant fall in gross profit. So just looking at the basics then, what does that mean? Well, what is their cost of goods sold? We're not given any information, but it seems to me that there's a fairly significant issue in the costs concerned or the costs that they are incurring in providing this service. Now, given the fact that this is broadly speaking, a sort of an ITIS company, it's in essence, a consultancy. Broadly speaking, I would suggest, again, I'm punting here, but I would suggest that this could be in some way related to staffing or HR, yeah, or possibly something to do with the area of the writing of software, programming, etc. It's difficult to know, I'm punting, but certainly we know that the cost of sales area or cost of goods sold or cost of services is going to be very specific for a company that's providing sort of data storage, computer facilities, etc., to a wide range of clients. So this is a question mark, okay? We can punt all we want, but the bottom line is, let's get the numbers under our belt and be ready for a question in this area. Now, final paragraph here, it says absence. Now, I touched on this up top. That's great. If I was one of the founders, I would want to be certainly left alone and free to run. But the bottom line is that on the day, on exam day, within the unseen, anything can happen. So I don't read too much into this and the idea of freedom and no dominance. I don't read much into that at all. Okay, because I think anything is on the table on exam day. Let me just show you the annotations here. Bear with me 1 second. Sorry that I have to keep doing this. So if we go down the page, just to make sure. Okay, so we've touched on autonomy and independence. Great. Okay, I've mentioned the CG point of corporate governance in terms of no changes. Don't we want to have some fresh blood, fresh impetus on the board? We are a listed company. I'm wondering if the shareholders, maybe linked into GP, are going to get humpy about something like that and how we would advise the board. Okay. Outside of that, I've touched on the idea of the agency principle. Now, SBL Examiner has examined that several times, and I recall marking a number of mock exam scripts. It's in a past paper from a couple of years ago. I can't remember the exact exam sitting, but I certainly recall that a fairly high proportion of students, around about 30%, messed up the question. I think the question was in the area of how many agency relationships are there, and it was some sort of NGO in some way, maybe a rail company. I can't remember, but that question wasn't dealt with well, and it seemed to me that students really didn't have a good enough feel. They maybe knew what it was, but they couldn't pick out agency, principle, and really talk about the various different relationships. I think that there were 2 or 3. So there's a flag if I ever saw one. Okay. Final point here, I've mentioned this, and this is very often mentioned in the unseen. So the exam paper, shareholder wealth maximization. This stewardship function. You may not be familiar with that, but think about the steward on a ship. Think about the directors acting in the shareholders' best interest, not in their own best interest. We don't like short-termism. We want to maximize wealth in the long term. What does that mean? Well, it means a dividend return, and it means capital appreciation on the shares. Okay, so that's the next section. I'll just turn the annotations off. This is a very interesting area for me. Okay, and when I say that, this area of the sort of vision, mission, and corporate values, when I say that, I mean that, the examiner likes this area. I've got quite a lot of annotations here. My apologies, a lot for you to take in. So let's keep it blank for the moment. So where we're into, we're talking about, why the company exists. We know that the mission is the purpose. You might call it the raison d'etre. I guess maybe the vision comes before that, and I always like to think of the vision of a company like NCTech as the preferred future. So they want to be the leading cloud company, cloud service provider in Farland, possibly beyond too. So I like what they've said here. I see clearly in terms of the mission, i.e. the purpose, it seems to cover a variety of very, very important areas. And certainly I recall a theorist some years ago when we were talking about, or not talking, but I recall studying missions, and I think the theorist was David, I'm not so sure. But in essence, he talked about how to write a mission statement, and I would suggest that this information here is on their website and part of their mission statement, obviously published. Now, in essence, what David said is, there's nothing that you shouldn't include. A mission statement could go on and on and on. But for me, there's nothing particularly missing here, possibly outside of maybe a mention of the area of ethics and indeed CSR. But that's by the by. I think this is pretty solid. Now, I'll tell you what I mean by the importance of this area in a moment when I show you the annotations. But for me, one common theme within the SBL exam, from my experience of teaching it and indeed writing mock exams, is this whole area of the link between the stated vision, the stated mission, and indeed the values, as we'll see over the page, and the stated corporate objectives, and something within the unseen. In other words, the sort of idea that, okay, we know what their mission and vision is, we know what their values are, their corporate objectives are probably in the area of shareholder wealth maximization, but listen, we're thinking about this, this, and this. How does that tie in? So the examiner will sort of ask you to compare the two. So what do? Well, first off, let's look for questions in that area. But secondly, let's be very, very clear. Let's memorize what their mission and vision is. I don't want to be in the exam thinking, well, what was their mission again? Or what? I want to have it at the tip of my fingertips, okay? So this area here of mission, vision, corporate values, for me is important. I'll do the values in a second, but let me just show you the annotations. I'd favor a question in this area. Okay, now, as you see, quite a lot of stuff here. So just definitions on the left-hand side for your purpose, but I'm sure you're aware of the key issues there in terms of defining those two areas. I quite like this here, this idea of world class. So part of the mission, world class, and it just made me think of benchmarking. In other words, the area of the comparison to, I guess, best practice. So, could we think of a scenario where you're presented with some information in relation to competitors in the marketplace, or indeed a need to benchmark? So I'm thinking of types of benchmarking. I'm thinking of problems associated with benchmarking, and I'm thinking of, how do we decide on best practice? And indeed, perhaps we get dissent in the ranks. Is it a good idea or not? Okay. Now, in terms of this area here, they say world class. Again, we've mentioned this within pre-scene video one. It seems to me that with a successful company, particularly one that's had a little bit of an issue on gross profit, not a little bit, dynamic marketplace, we're told within the early part of the pre-scene that this is a market that's growing rapidly. We know that expansion is on the cards, and we know probably it's got to be in this area. I mean, it could be somewhere else, but he's pinpointed or signposted this several times. So even if it isn't, let's be familiar with ANSOF and the possibilities, new, existing. Let's also be familiar with how risk sort of increases as we go. Our sort of go-to expansion option is clearly market penetration. Yeah. So existing service, existing market. If we go across the diagram, as it were, towards diversification, new market, new service, I'm not so sure. So we've got three main options, haven't we? We've got penetration, number one, probably market development, number two, and product development, number three, and in terms of increasing risk. Okay, moving down the page, I've referenced reputation before. Certainly, there's a lot of risks, as we'll see in a moment, across the board for NCTech. And, clearly one of the big ones is reputation. This is a very, very competitive market. All we need is some sort of major cyber attack, some major problem in terms of the service that they're offering, and then things could get rough very, very quickly. Okay. In terms of sustainable relationships, there's not too much reference to ethics and CSR. There's several references to ethics, yes, but nothing too much in the area of corporate social responsibility. But it seems to me, based on my feeling for NCTech, and indeed what we see within this pre-scene, that this is a company and indeed a set of board directors that are highly likely to be CSR friendly. In other words, everything that they do is about being a good corporate citizen. And I draw your attention to the sort of, the theorists in that area, both within the SBL syllabus and outside it. So I'm talking about, Johnson, Scholes and Whittington, short-term shareholder interest, etc. And also Carroll in terms of levels of social responsibility. So obviously, we're talking about economic, philanthropic, etc. I always like a student to wheel in to a question where it's relevant, let's say on CSR, some nice theory. And it's not overly difficult to get savvy on the whole area of CSR and the key theories. There's not too many of them. Final point here, just in relation to the profitability issue, we've discussed that. Just down the bottom here, because we're in the area of mission, vision, and corporate values, I wanted to make sure, that you're aware of the hierarchy. So, if I was to set up a business now, any business, and I knew that it was going to be highbrow, very successful, etc., then really what I'd be talking about, I guess, based on the SBL syllabus, is to consider values first, then vision, then mission, then objectives, and then we get down into the detailed metrics. So be aware of the sort of hierarchy and indeed what these things mean. I think you know that already. Right-hand side here, I mentioned this up top. I'm talking about the sort of trade-off, the idea, okay, this is our mission, vision and values, but the unseen presents something to us in the area of X, Y, Z, and you're asked, well, is this in line? Is this okay? So without, I think, rote learning these areas, we can deal with a question like that because it'll be a lot easier if you can quote it off the top of your head, okay? For me, certainly something that goes against stated mission, value, vision, etc. is a no-no. Absolutely a no-no. And I think generally speaking, I think that's what the examiner would want you to be doing in an exam question, is saying, well, I'm not so sure about that because of this. Okay, hope that makes sense. Let me just turn off the annotations and then just move into the next section. I hope everything is making sense. So we're into the values now. And again, these are important because as you saw from the hierarchy, it's highly likely that these core values were decided upon probably by the founders, maybe from the off 10 years ago. All the E's. Now, quite a few points to make here. I'll go from the top down in a moment, but I just want to draw your attention to something that we've touched on, but I haven't touched on in any great detail. If I was to pick topic areas that would feature in your exam, we all know that ethics has a very, very strong chance of coming up. Why? Because ethics underpins the professional syllabus for ACCA. Without ethics, we don't really have anything at all. And for me, in terms of students dealing with ethical questions, generally speaking, tend to do okay. But, where they don't, for me, when I'm marking a script, for me, it's quite a big no-no. Ethics questions are quite straightforward. Messing up an ethics question should be illegal. Don't mess up an ethics question, because I think the marker would think, wow, you can't even deal with a low-level ethics question. What is there to ethics? Not too much. How is it defined? Well, it's the difference between right and wrong. We know within the ACCA it's underpinned by copy COPPI, armamonic, confidentiality, objectivity, professional behavior, professional competence, and integrity. Okay? We need to know the buzzwords underneath all of those banners. And in addition to that, we've got to be ready to deal with some form of ethical problem, some form of ethical dilemma. Okay? Now, just one or two more points. I know that I'm laboring this, but this is one of my go-to topics, so I am going to labor it because I want you to pass this exam. If we do get an ethics question, whether or not it's signposted within the requirement or whether or not just on the day you feel, well, I could make an ethical point, be careful, because what I've seen students do quite a lot in ethics questions is, they remember copy and they wheel out the whole 9 yards, all 5 elements. There is absolutely no chance in the SBL exam that all elements of copy, all 5, are going to be relevant to that scenario. That is mistake number 1. Okay? What the examiner is looking for you to do, and the marker, is apply your knowledge. So be careful. If I was to choose a couple, 2 or 3, and say, okay, Paul, in your experience, what are the ones that tend to come up more often than the others? Because there are a couple. Well, the first one is objectivity. The second one is integrity. And probably the third one is professional behavior. But certainly 1 and 2, I'd bet my house on them. Yeah? So if they're not in the scenario, if you're not talking about them where ethics is in play, for me, there's something seriously wrong with your answer. Yeah? Now, I can't guarantee this, but that's my experience. I'm only telling you what I've seen within the SBL exam, and indeed within other professional bodies when you're presented with an ethical dilemma. And let's bear in mind that the ethical dilemma style questions, someone's done this or this has happened, it all sounds a bit dodgy, that's the easiest way for the SBL examiner to introduce ethics. I'm not saying that's the only way, but it's the easiest way. In other words, he says something like, okay, this is the scenario, advise the board or advise the CEO on a way forward. Okay, so let me just turn on the annotations now, a couple of key ones for us. Just in terms, let's finish off the ethics and I'll go up top in a second. Have a look at this. You'll see that there is a technical article on the ACCA website that is entitled AAA. So this is the American model for ethical dilemmas. It's a little bit more long-winded than other models, but I like it because it's simple. In other words, it gives you a set of steps to employ, as if you're in real life or in the exam, as to how to deal with an ethical dilemma. Yeah, and it's simple, easy to learn. Okay, this point here is the one that I've made. Remember, apply your knowledge. And if you think that all elements are copy and play, you're in the wrong exam. Okay, just going back up to the top here, I know that we're talking about values, but I did like the fact that when they say, grasp opportunities, it just, for some reason or other, made me think about strategic planning. It made me think about the point that I made in pre-scene video 1 about, how would they plan forward? In other words, how do they operate in a strategic planning sense? When they talk about energy, it says grasp opportunities, make things happen. That seems to me to be sort of, let's play what's on the pitch in front of us, rather than what we know of the sort of formal approach or rational approach to strategic planning, which obviously involves a number of steps, analysis, choice, etc. More of that in a moment. So in terms of the values, just to summarize and move on into the board structure area, what we've said is, this is definitely a go-to topic for us. This is important. Let's be on the case in terms of the definitions, and let's watch out for that classic question that he likes to throw in, where he'll present you with that scenario, and one element of that scenario will go against, the mission, the vision, the values, etc. Okay, hope that made sense. Let me just turn off annotations and move down the page. So we're into the board structure now. We know that CG is mentioned many, many times now, is an important area. On the face of it, everything is fine. They say they comply with Farland CG regime. Great. They certainly have all the boxes ticked in terms of the 4 committees. Let's remember that, strictly speaking, certainly under the UK CG regime, there's no necessity to have a risk committee. Normally that would be dealt with by an audit committee, but they're ticking all the boxes and covering all the bases. I like what I see on screen. I like the fact that there are 6 and 6 on either side, executive, non-executive. Everything seems great, but I'm a bit of a I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist, I'm afraid, and I don't know. Maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here, but maybe I'm thinking that maybe some students say, well, everything looks fine, happy days. Well, I won't study corporate governance. No, corporate governance has a very, very strong chance of coming up in the exam. So, I'm not going to dwell on this. We know that there's a lot of volume in the corporate governance area of the SBL syllabus. We've got to be familiar with it. It can be a little bit dry. It can be a little bit tedious. Take it in bite-sized chunks. Get familiar with the main principles. What does fully compliant with corporate governance principles mean? You can take Farland for being, I think, broadly speaking, the UK code. I don't think that the examiner will bring in this idea of rules-based or Sarbanes-Oxley over at the US. I don't think so. I think we're looking at the basic good corporate governance. Key principles, stakeholder relations, independence, solid NEDs, etc., etc. Okay, I've red flagged it because I'm a conspiracy theorist. My apologies. Let me just turn on the annotations now so that you can see what I've said. Okay, I made it too solid for me. My apologies. That's just me. Too solid for me. We know what to do. Okay, so that's basically it. Not too much on that particular area. I'm going to move down into the risk area now. Quite a lot here. My apologies for the amount of annotations that you are just about to see, but I thought really better to sort of go the whole hog and overdo it than underdo it. I don't like underdoing stuff, and I like to think that we're sort of in a little bit of a little battle with the examiner and trying to figure him out. So I'm thinking of all the areas that come into my mind as I flow down this particular pre-scene, and I've read it many, many times now, rest assured. So what do we think here? Well, we know that given the fact that there's a risk committee, we certainly expect a risk register. All of this looks great. They've got a bulletproof risk committee with the right people on it. Seems to me they're doing exactly what they need to do. They even have this risk manager reporting into the ops director and indeed to the chair. Now, in terms of this risk area, I've mentioned it once or twice already. We know at a basic level, that we have to be familiar with the 10 or 12 or 15 different types of risk that any company, NCTech or otherwise, could come into contact with. We know that some for NCTech will be more important than others. So for example, they only deal at the moment with Farland-based clients. So I would have thought political risk is restricted to Farland and the Farland regulatory regime. International risk, for example, is not overly relevant to them. In addition to that, we know how important things like strategic risk is, and when we think about possibilities for expansion, let's say going from IAAS to another direction, what are the risks associated with them moving in that direction from a strategic perspective? So let's think of that type of thing. Okay, let me put the annotations up and you'll see that there's a fair amount of stuff here. Okay, so in terms of risk area, outside of point number 1, which I mentioned, we know how we grade them. Yeah, we know likelihood or probability and impact. We also are familiar with TARA, I hope. Okay, so we see that the risk committee, as you would expect, responsible for appetite. And then indeed outside of that, let's remember these definitions. I've said earlier on, I talked about what I like seeing in SBL scripts is the reference to good theory. So make sure you're clear on the difference between the three. Risk committee responsible for what or how much the business will accept. Certainly attitude can be different from stakeholder to stakeholder. And I've mentioned that, more of that in a moment. In other words, let's just say that the directors, or indeed, let's say the founders, maybe a different attitude towards shareholders. Or let's just say that, I don't know, the institutional investors may have a slightly different attitude towards members of the public who are also investing via the Foreign Stock Exchange. So let's be familiar with the terminology. Capacity, you don't see that as much reference, but let's understand what it is, maximum risk. Okay, so this is a reference to the question or the scenario that I set up top. In other words, two parties, maybe more than two, having slightly opposing views. Okay, so that's the first part of the risk. I'm going to move into the second. Just get rid of the annotations. Here we go. And a lot more stuff here, bear with me. Now, here we're referencing the actual risk per the risk register. Now, there's a lot of information here. In fact, let me just put that up slightly because I think I've got some annotations up top. I've said red flag here for a variety of different reasons I'll explain in a moment. Dealing with competitive area, we see across the board in this pre-scene that this is an extremely competitive environment. We know that in terms of market share, based on the stated revenues, NCTech are not massive compared to the competitors in this marketplace. There are companies, multinational, worldwide companies, who are humongous in comparison. Okay, so again, as mentioned, there are new entrants who may decide to enter the market, but there are also big players, and it may well be that NCTech is a target in some way, shape, or form. Okay, back to that in a moment. In terms of the staffing side, there's several references in this area of business risk to possible problems in the area of cyber breaches, data, etc., etc. It's mentioned here and it's mentioned down below. This is a common theme, a common thread in this pre-scene document. If we ignore it at our peril. Okay, I have some detail for you on typical, or indeed an article that I found for the top 5 cyber risks for companies as of now, according to the ICAEW, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. Nice little article. I'm hoping you might be able to Google that. Nice and short and sweet. Okay, just moving down the page, as I say, this area of tech issues or tech risks is exactly what we expect. I mean, outside of some issue with internet service providers, would he go there? Possibly, but I think more likely is some sort of attack, some sort of threat, some sort of denial of service, etc. Again, in terms of point number 4, data security. So we have, broadly speaking, 3 sort of references in this area of the business risk that they face. 3 references to one of our hot topics. Okay, let's be familiar with the terminology, as I said, within pre-scene video 1. Okay, in terms of the regulatory changes, you'll see when we look at the PEST area, the strategic analysis video outside of the 3 pre-scene videos, that we make reference to not least the environment, but several other areas outside of NTech, one of them obviously being law, regulation, not just here in Farland, but also elsewhere if they decide to expand. Okay, so let me just go back up. So there's the 5. Now, what detail do I have for you? I've got a fair amount of detail on 1 or 2 areas of research, quite possibly for you, if you would like to, and I would like you to. So, first things first, in terms of this area of the competitive threats, let's remember the point that I made in pre-scene video 1 in terms of the link between high barriers and indeed low threat. It's a competitive threat. We don't know how strong the threat is. I would say that certainly the threat from other competitors in the marketplace now, right now, is very high. The threat of new entrants, they're saying new entrants capturing existing market share. New entrants means people arriving new. I would say it's probably more likely from existing players within the market. Okay, absolutely. Now, I've mentioned this here, this area of the definitions up top when we talked about attitude. So really what we're talking about here is we're talking about the question that I said that the examiner could set. In other words, we could have the directors and or shareholders and or perhaps institutional investors having different views. Let's be familiar and let's watch out for these in the scenario, i.e. the unseen. Yeah, different people have different ideas based on their circumstances. I've put in a little bit of work for you to do. I'm just wondering, what does that mean? What does a lot mean? I don't want to hand everything to you on a plate within this pre-scene video. I want to get you to do some work. So what does that mean? And if you know what it means, or if you can find out what it means, how might we use that in a question? I would suggest fairly easily. Okay, moving down the page, I've mentioned the whole area of ethics a couple of times now, and I've mentioned resolving or solving ethical dilemmas. Remember my reference to 3A. Again, technical articles. There's a good technical article on the 3A, American Association of Accounting Business tech article on how to solve ethical dilemmas. Just a quick aside on technical articles. One of the things that I do or have done a lot, whether it's in SBL or indeed other papers, is check the most recent technical articles issued by the ACCA. I'm amazed sometimes when I ask students, particularly when I used to teach face-to-face, maybe on day 1 or day 2, early on, how many people read the technical articles? Very few. I mean, the ACCA go to the trouble of releasing these articles for good reason. If you haven't been through, let's say ballpark, the last 9 to 12 months of articles, or if you go on to the ACCA site and Google SBL, search SBL technical articles, go from the top of the page down and do 10 or 12. Now, you don't need to be an expert on them, but get savvy with the main ones, because I've seen in the past these articles come up in some way, shape or form. I can't guarantee it, but they're there for a reason, everybody. Okay, so ethics we've covered. Now, this is the bit here that I had mentioned earlier on. In other words, we've said that under this business risk area, the whole cyber thing is going nuts. Okay, now this article, which you can easily find if you just Google ICAW top 5 cyber risks, is excellent. I say it's excellent because it's short and sweet. I like when I'm researching any area, if I was studying for an exam, I like to be able to get in and out of articles quickly, and it's only a couple of pages. And what it says, I've just highlighted the main ones. These are the 5. So a job for you, once you've been through these videos, is what do these mean? Maybe you know what they mean, but what you'll see within the article, outside of the ICAW describing clearly that these are the top 5 today. This is a 2023 article, by the way. What it also does is it gives the reader, or indeed the relevant company, action points to be able to avoid these areas. Okay, so it's a very good article. I'd certainly take a look at that if I was you. Easy to find, just Google it. Moving down the page, we're sort of into the final section, the current strategic position, and that's really where we're going to be dealing with pre-scene video 3. I'll just show you the sort of detail here. There's a fair amount of sort of information in terms of the current strategic position, so you can look forward to that. Okay, just going back to the top now, I hope that this second video has made sense, and that you're okay with all the annotations and the different colors, etc. Just take it step by step. That would be my view. We're just really looking for ideas, aren't we? And I think the key, outside of watching the Astranti videos and indeed taking some guidance from me within these videos, the key obviously at this stage, you know, with the clock ticking, is really that there should be smoke coming off your keyboard. We should be doing question after question after question and testing our knowledge. I mean, you know, the easiest way to find success, in my opinion, particularly 2 weeks out, is to fail. Okay, I hope that you take that on board. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to you joining me for pre-scene video 3 and indeed the other videos in the set. Cheers.
So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you have found it useful. If you did enjoy this video and you want to see more of it, then please do visit our website www.astranti.com. We have a free ACCA SBL pre-scene pack that includes all 3 videos for the pre-scene analysis, the strategic analysis, and the top 10 pre-scene issues. In addition to that, we also have our industry analysis document and 2 ACCA SBL mock exams with complete solutions for you to practice ahead of the exam. And also, you have access to our SBL discussion board, so you and fellow students like yourself in the same position studying for this exam will be able to chat, will be able to ask questions and receive answers from our tutors. And the best part is all of this is completely free. In order to access this, please click the link in the description or visit the website www.astranti.com and sign up for our free ACCA SBL resources now. So thank you again for watching this video, and do check out that website for more free content.